It's not enough. It's not enough. He's reduced it by a few ministries. Let's look at the most important problem in South Africa, the economy. We still have a number of ministers in the economy and many more deputy ministers. I would have called on the president to make a much bigger cut, ensure that we have an efficient government. But what's the plan? Is the plan about delivering jobs? And therefore, how do we streamline government to achieve that? It seems like this was a balancing of factions rather than, in fact, delivering a plan against South Africa.
Now, look, I think the context of our rejection of the still bloated cabinet of President Ramaphosa is that, one, currently South Africa has got a budget deficit of more than 200 billion rands, meaning that like expenditure items that have been allocated there's 200 billion shortfall in terms of what is needed. And overall, South Africa is in a debt of more than now almost 3 trillion rands. That is like now approaching 60% of South Africa's GDP. So we're in a crisis in terms of resources. That is why we have always emphasized that in terms of unnecessary expenditures, the state has to be frugal. It has to take a different approach in terms of how do you reduce unnecessary expenditures. And we believe very strongly that deputy ministers who do not have any executive functions cannot be part of an executive. Like, it's not necessary, because it's not like a deputy minister has got any specified role in many instances. They are just some glorified executive personal assistants of ministers. They cannot be given any function. When a minister is absent, they cannot even act as a minister. So it's just a waste of money, because when you have got 36 deputy ministers, it means that you must have 36 support staff in Pretoria, in Cape Town, houses, security, cars, everything else. That then bloats the amounts that are going to be expended on an unnecessary function. It doesn't add any value. There are far much bigger countries in the world that are operating with far much lesser people than South Africa is trying to do now. Sure, it doesn't add any developmental value.
Happy. For instance, if you look at the core ministries, and I call them the most important ones to ensure that we have a stable economy in South Africa. For instance, the Minister of Finance, Mboweni. If you look at the state-owned enterprises, which is Pravin Gordhan, as well as Minister Patel for economic development. I think those were good choices, and I think it can evoke some confidence from potential investors in South Africa. So we welcome that. But it is also clear that the President had a long day behind him, and it was not an easy one. And for the fact that we still have Mabuza as the Deputy President means that they're lining him up for a future President of South Africa, which I don't think will be a good thing for the future. Also, if you look for surprises, the fact that Patricia de Lille.
At the outset, the IFP would want to congratulate the newly appointed executive, who obviously may have reservations in certain areas, but this is the hand that South Africa has been dealt, and it is now incumbent on us as parliamentarians, as opposition parties, to actually hold those elected now to account, to exercise our duties and functions of oversight to the best of our ability. And this is incumbent on a functional and effective and efficient parliament. It is very clear from the outset that the president had to balance the warring factions within the ANC, and so he walked a very fine line, and that is why you saw a classical case of political musical chairs, because essentially what we have is the same cast and the same script. It is also clear that the reconfiguration that the president spoke about, whilst it may have happened, certainly did not go the whole 9 yards. If you look at the fact that the number of deputy ministers remains very, very high. But the president, of course, in his opening remarks, even last night, he did say that this is some of the configuration. So we are expecting further changes. But in the main, it is now our collective expectation as the IFP that the newly elected executive will hit the ground running and will actually be committed to the ANC's commitments that they made to the electorate, and ours is to play our part to ensure that service delivery and the improvement of lives in South Africa is realized.